The year is 1863, and everything's changing. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation is re-motivating Union troops. The joint victories at the Bergs, Vicksburg and Gettysburg, are a sign that the fortunes of the North are shifting, while Lee is retreating back into his beloved Virginia. What a year. And it culminates in arguably the most famous presidential speech in U.S. history, Lincoln's address at Gettysburg, also known as the Gettysburg Address. On November 19th, 1863, side note, one day after my birthday, just saying, Lincoln dedicated a cemetery for Union soldiers who were killed at Gettysburg. In just 272 words, for reference, that's like less than one page double-spaced, Lincoln set out his new motivation for the North in the ongoing Civil War. As he put it, "The world will little note nor long remember what we say here." Ooh, that aged poorly. "But it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. That we were highly resolved that these dead shall not have died in vain. That this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth." So by the end of 1863, the fight in the North had become nothing less than a fight for liberation and the creation of a more just United States that would move it closer to its original promise that all men are created equal. Over the next year of the war, while Lee's army was fleeing and then evading Union troops, Union forces across the West were sweeping up. And by the way, as someone who is not a student of military history, I just want to let you know that each side of the war had multiple armies. I always got confused by this. How could Lee and Lee's army be in so many places at once? I mean, if anyone could do it, it would probably be Robert. But in wars like this one, there are multiple armies led by various Confederate generals across the South, just like there are multiple armies led by various Union generals trying to capture them if they just stay still. Eventually, General William Tecumseh Sherman brought his army into the Deep South. 1 year after Gettysburg, the battle and ultimate surrender of Atlanta was a huge psychological blow to the South, especially considering that Atlanta was becoming the industrial and railroad hub of the South. Side note, Atlanta's original name was Terminus because it was where all the trains ended up. If there's any Walking Dead fans out there, is that show still on? Oh God, is Coral still alive? Anyway, in the North, the capture of Atlanta helped Lincoln get re-elected over former General George McClellan. McClellan had run on a platform to make peace with the Confederacy, but the defeat and destruction of Atlanta's military facilities were burned down by Confederate troops, by the way, to keep them from falling into the hands of the Union military. But this dramatic win for the North convinced voters that they should stick with Lincoln, and he won in a landslide. If we weren't sure how much the Union strategy had evolved from a targeted attempt to bring back the South into a total effort to force the South into submission, we just need to look at Sherman's march to the sea. After taking Atlanta, General Sherman led 60,000 soldiers on a 285-mile march from Atlanta to Savannah, Georgia. His purpose? To scare the crap out of Southerners in the hopes that they would abandon the cause. As Sherman put it, "We are not only fighting hostile armies, but a hostile people. We need to make old and young, rich and poor feel the hard hand of war." I bet Sherman was really fun at a cocktail party. Now, contrary to popular belief, Sherman's troops did not destroy entire towns in their path, but they did just about everything else. They stole food and livestock, burned the property of civilians who fought back. Southerners fled in advance of Sherman's troops, often destroying their own land so the Union Army couldn't use it. This is one of the earliest examples of a new concept called total war. By the mid-19th century, the nature of warfare was changing from something that is fought only by soldiers on faraway battlefields into something that reaches every corner of a nation at war. The idea is that civilians are supporting the war from the home front, and so the home front, including factories, farms, and railroads, is fair game as far as enemy troops are concerned. And although we now are very familiar with this tactic thanks to the ultimate total war, World War II, at the time, Southerners were horrified by Sherman's methods, and they still are. Seriously, my father-in-law grew up in Atlanta, and he still talks about Sherman's march as if he were there. He also always wrote Robert E. on the tag of all his Lee jeans, but that's a story for another day. Sherman's tactics were brutal, but they worked. Morale in the South was low, and the destruction of Southern production capability made it even harder for them to keep fighting the powerful North. Sherman's troops arrived in Savannah on December 21st, 1864, 3 weeks after leaving Atlanta, and Sherman formally presented the city of Savannah, along with 25,000 bales of cotton that he shipped to D.C., to President Lincoln as an early Christmas gift. I guess that answers the question, what do you get a guy who already has it all? For the next few months, Sherman marched up toward Virginia, while General Grant brought his troops down from the north and then the west. Lee had surrendered the capital of Richmond and was retreating westward to try to meet up with General Johnston's forces, but the North cut him off. After a last-ditch attack, Lee was forced to admit that it was over. He sent a rider to request a suspension of fighting to allow them to negotiate a formal surrender. And the rider delivered the message to a rising general named George Custer, along with a warning to stay away from Native Americans. I'm just kidding, but Custer really should have stayed away from Native Americans. You'll see. Custer responded that the Union would, quote, listen to no terms but that of unconditional surrender. The South isn't getting any sort of deal out of this. And this sparked the first of many discussions about what to do with the Confederates after the war was over. At Appomattox, Grant and Lee made a simple gentleman's agreement. There would be no mass imprisonment or executions. The defeated enemies wouldn't be paraded through the streets. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia would surrender their weapons, go home, and agree, quote, not to take up arms against the government of the United States. Again. He even granted Lee's request that men could keep their horses so that they could go back to work on their farms. Grant sent out the order to all Union troops. The war is over. The rebels are our countrymen again, and the best sign of rejoicing after the victory will be to abstain from all demonstrations in the field. Basically, be cool. Act like you've won a war before. Let's not rub their faces in it. Within weeks, all of the Confederate armies spread out across the South and the West surrendered, and on May 10th, 1865, any remaining resistance collapsed when Confederate President Jefferson Davis was captured in Georgia. Before we move on, a few interesting firsts about the Civil War. Many military historians call the Civil War the first modern war because of its use of many modern weapons and technology. But not to be a world history teacher, but technically the Crimean War was the first modern war. Like, they were using mini rifles, telegraphs, and steamships on the Black Sea like a decade before it was cool. But it is true that a lot of military technology was introduced on a large scale during the American Civil War, and it's definitely the first modern war in US history. And of course, nothing sparks innovation quite like trying not to die. In 1861, most soldiers were still using muskets, but by the end they had rifles with modern bullets that traveled faster, were more accurate, and did more damage than round lead balls. These new bullets were called minie balls, named after their French inventor. Maybe it's minie? I don't know. Man, our military owes a lot to the French. Both navies introduced ironclad steamships that replaced wooden sailing ships, and the Civil War also saw the first successful use of the submarine. Well, successful with an asterisk. The Confederate submarine, named the Hunley, was powered by 8 men who turned a propeller with a hand crank. It only served one mission when it successfully sank the USS Housatonic, but then the submarine sank like minutes later. I'm sure someone will get on improving submarine design. I just hope it's not the Germans. Troops also strung up telegraph wire wherever they went, allowing communication to be quicker than ever between commanders. And the new art form of photography helped bring images of the war back home. So what does the Civil War mean for American history? Well, it resolved 2 fundamental issues we'd been dealing with for decades. It was now clear that the US was an indivisible nation bound together by the Constitution. And it finally settled that whole all men are created equal paradox, at least on paper. 700,000 Americans died, meaning that more Americans died in the Civil War than in the Revolution, World War I, World War II, and Vietnam combined. And we weren't done, because now we had to figure out where to go from here. And unfortunately, we had to do it with Andrew Johnson. Frickin' Johnson. Because Lincoln was assassinated just 5 days after the Civil War ended. That kills me. Lee surrendered to Grant on Sunday, and Lincoln was shot on Friday. Good Friday, actually. He didn't even get a weekend to celebrate the victory. Lincoln's assassin, John Wilkes Booth, was a B-list actor who sympathized with the Confederacy but stayed in the North to pursue his acting career. Originally, the earlier plan was for him and a few associates to kidnap Lincoln and bring him as a prisoner to the Confederate capital of Richmond. On the day of the planned kidnapping, Lincoln didn't show up where they were waiting, and just 2 weeks later, Richmond was taken by Union forces, so that didn't work. So now the new plan was to assassinate Lincoln, Vice President Johnson, and Secretary of State Seward all at the same time. Booth hoped that this might be enough to throw the government into disarray and provide the Confederacy an opportunity to pick back up fighting. Remember, the Civil War wasn't officially over just because Lee surrendered. There were still other armies out there fighting. Lee was just kind of the main guy, so at that point it really wasn't looking good. Booth found out that the president would be going to see a play at the Ford Theater. He slipped into his booth and shot Abraham Lincoln in the back of the head. Booth then jumped from the box onto the stage and shouted the Virginia state motto, Sic semper tyrannis, thus ever to tyrants. Oh my God, of course this guy was an actor. How dramatic. Obviously, enough people in the theater recognized John Wilkes Booth because he was an actor, in the theater. It would kind of be like Brad Pitt doing something crazy at a movie theater, and then everyone going, wait, was that Brad Pitt? Although, actually, that's giving Booth way too much credit. So, substitute Brad Pitt for Mel Gibson or Shia LaBeouf. That seems more realistic. Anyway, over 10,000 federal troops, detectives, and police participated in the manhunt for Lincoln's assassin. Along with an accomplice, he fled to Virginia, where he was found holed up in a barn a few days later. Union troops set the barn on fire, and his accomplice surrendered, but Booth stayed inside. Claiming that he had raised his gun to shoot, a sergeant shot Booth in the neck. Booth was carried out of the barn, and he died hours later, apparently staring at his hands and saying, useless, useless. I don't know, he got some use out of them. 4 of Booth's co-conspirators, including the men who failed to assassinate Johnson and Seward, were convicted and executed by hanging. And this group also included the first woman ever put to death by the federal government. That's not quite what Susan B. Anthony meant when she told everyone to start smashing the patriarchy, but whatever. Mary Surratt owned a boarding house in D.C. that became a safe haven for the Confederates. Her son invited pro-Southern friends, including Booth, over to plan the conspiracy. And although she claimed innocence, people testified that she had told friends to provide weapons for the conspirators and was very aware of the assassination plan. Lincoln was only 56 when he died. For reference, that's about the same age Barack Obama was when he left office. And we'll never know what else he could have accomplished. The surgeons who completed the autopsy stared at the bullet they removed from his skull and later wrote, "The cause of such mighty changes in the world's history as we may perhaps never realize." So the war is over. The Union forced the South to stay at literal gunpoint. 4 million Black Americans are newly emancipated. And we have an accidental president in office whose middle name might as well be conflict of interest. Because, oh yeah, did I mention Andrew Johnson, the new president, is a Southerner? Yeah, let's see how this post-war rebuilding turns out. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe and join patreon.com/antisocialstudies.